Right, it's another page one critique in my glorious series of page one critiques, and this time it's Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind. I'm going to do some general news before I move into the main portion of this presentation. Apologies if I look a bit rough, that's because I'm a bit rough. Last week, my youngest daughter, Kellen, who's severely disabled, stopped breathing in the middle of the night, and so we rushed to hospital and we spent a week there. And this graph here, which shows the number of people who had to wait more than 4 hours, and then in orange, more than 12 hours in A&E in the UK. It's a drastic rise over the last 12 years there. We were part of that debacle. This graph, by the way, is a choice. It's to do with how we choose to spend our money, and we're all going to end up in hospital in the end. So you should really put some money into making sure it's not a complete nightmare. So we arrived at about 8 o'clock at night and spent the next 10 hours in A&E. She was stabilized very early on, but waiting to go up to a ward. And we got to the ward at about 6 o'clock in the morning. And it was the intensive care unit, so there's no parent beds or anything. This was the solution here, this comfy chair for me catching up on the sleep, having sat up next to Kellen all night. We ended up staying in ICU for the whole week, not because she was critically ill all that time, but because in the last few days, when she was okay to move on to another ward, there was no bed in this hospital, which is a vast hospital. I didn't have to sleep on that chair the entire time. They did manage to bring in a reclining one, but it was shaped roughly like a capital W, so it wasn't the most comfortable of things for an old man to spend a week on. And this is us in ICU, our view, so it's all permanently lit and there's noise and lights going on all over the place. I just wanted to show you that fantasy has reached into even here, because on that whiteboard over there, you can see winter is coming. So the long arm of George R.R. Martin had reached in. Other news, we are seeing a lot of, do I have it up here? Yes, I do. A lot of SPFBO finalist coins arriving. We did a fundraiser to make it possible to send these coins also out to not just the current and future finalists, but in retrospect to past finalists, and those are starting to hit home. Have one here. This is actually the test that they sent me, so it's got nothing on the edges, as you can see. In the real thing, it's got the self-published fantasy blog off written around the edges, but these are nice things to have, and they are now hitting home across the world, and you'll see lots of pictures of people, of finalists with their books and their coins. So let's go on to the Wizard's First Rule. I may have to terminate this and restart with a bit of my flashy editing later on. Just because Kellen's carers are out with her at the moment, and none of them at the moment can feed her, so they'll bring her back, and I may have to take over and give her some food. So this is actually the book that, when I'm giving my standard disclaimer, I say, well, don't take me too seriously, because there's many famous and popular books that I have not liked the first page of, and this was the prime example. This book, in fact, and I found it at random on our shelves. I think my best friend had recommended it to my wife, who had then got I think 2 or 3 of them, but I didn't know any of this. I just pulled it off the shelf and started reading it, and I read the first page and thought, no, this is terrible. I'm going to give up. And I feel free in giving my opinion on this, because the author has died. That's unfortunate, but it means I can't hurt their feelings. And they're also New York Times #1 bestseller, one of the first, possibly the first fantasy books to gain that distinction. And so this author, Terry Goodkind, has been wildly successful, sold far more books than I'm ever going to. So again, I feel that he's fairly bulletproof in terms of any criticism that I aim his way. But these are just my thoughts on the item in question. As bears notice also that Terry Goodkind was a very divisive figure in fantasy. He made a number of statements, basically saying that he didn't write fantasy. Now, here's one in quotes: "I don't write fantasy. I write stories that have important human themes. They have elements of romance, history, adventure, mystery, philosophy. Most fantasy is one-dimensional. It's either about magic or a world building. I don't do either." And I mean, that's nonsense, frankly, isn't it? He does huge amounts of world building, I'm told, and there's lots of magic. But to dismiss all of fantasy as being one-dimensional, or most of it, and to pretend that fantasy doesn't have important human themes, and if it's got important human themes in it, then it is not fantasy, is again silliness. But I didn't know any of this when I read his first page and abandoned the entire book on the basis that it was so unappealing to me. So there's my standard disclaimer, which, as I've said, contains Terry in it. Let's read the first page and then have a think about what it's doing. It was an odd-looking vine. Dusky, variegated leaves hunkered against the stem that wound in a stranglehold around the smooth trunk of a balsam fir. Sap drooled down the wounded bark, and dry limbs slumped, making it look as if the tree were trying to voice a moan into the cool, damp morning air. Pods stuck out from the vine here and there along its length, almost seeming to look warily about for witnesses. It was the smell that first caught his attention, a smell like the decomposition of something that had been wholly unsavoury even in life. Richard combed his fingers through his thick hair as his mind lifted out of the fog of despair, coming into focus upon seeing the vine. He scanned for others but saw none. Everything else looked normal. The maples of the upper Venn forest were already tinged with crimson, proudly showing off their new mantle in the light breeze. With nights getting colder, it wouldn't be long before their cousins down in the Heartland woods joined them. The oaks, being the last to surrender to the season, still stoically wore their dark green coats. Having spent most of his life in the woods, Richard knew all the plants, if not by name, by sight. From when Richard was very small, his friend Zed had taken him along hunting for special herbs. He had shown Richard which ones to look for, where they grew and why, and put names to everything they saw. Many times they just talked, the old man treating him as an equal, asking him as much as he answered. Zed had sparked Richard's hunger to learn to know. This vine, though, he had only seen once before, and it wasn't in the woods. He had found a sprig of it at his father's house in the blue clay jar Richard had made when he was a boy. His father had been a trader and had travelled often, looking for the chance exotic or rare item. People of means had often sought him out, interested in what he might have turned up. It seemed to be the looking more than the finding that he had liked. As always, he had been happy to part with his latest discovery so that he could be off after the next. There you have it. I'll just sip my coffee. So, as I say, I still think that's a really bad first page. It's got the 1980s stamped all over it, and the book was written in the I guess early 90s. So it's a slow wandering start. It's there's no immediacy to it. There's no tension, and it harks back to the days of the big fat fantasy in the 80s, where basically once you'd bought a chunk like this and you'd spent your money, the author could assume that you were just going to plow on in. You were just going to read it because there was no internet to seek people's opinions about beforehand. There was no, on Amazon, go and read the first few pages. You didn't have many alternatives. You bought this book and you couldn't just hop onto the internet or watch a million channels. There just wasn't a lot to do. So if you had this book, you were going to plow on, and if the first page was a bit of a yawn, well, you were going to keep on going, and maybe if it caught you by page 200, then you'd go out and tell your mates, oh, "This is a great book. I'm on page 400 now, and I'm really enjoying it." But as advice to new writers, um, you can't do that to your readership anymore. The vast majority of them will not give you that um, hold over them, and so you would be better advised, I feel, to write um, a more engaging first page. Why not? So, as I said, New York Times #1 best-selling book. So, what do I know? But I'm going to tell you what I know anyway. Um, it's not a great opening line. It was an odd-looking vine, but it does pose a question. At least we want to know what was odd about it. Unfortunately, what was odd about it wasn't anything particularly exciting. It wasn't like there was blood oozing from its leaves or any of this nonsense. We just then get a description of a vine. It's not like, I mean, this is what hit me. I think I went to my wife or my friend at the time, and I read this like 20 years ago at the first page. That's between 10 and 20. And I think I said, this guy's just spent a page literally describing a vine. I mean, how is that supposed to engage me? We're talking about, its variegated leaves, and the fact it's winding around a tree. Vines wind around trees, or it's the nature of vines to wind around things and climb up them. Uh, there's just nothing in this first 10% of page one. It's telling us about a pretty ordinary looking vine. And I noted here that a lot of the writers in the 80s and early 90s were attempting to clone Tolkien. And that was a pretty good strategy because you could sell 10 million books off the back of it. Like The Sword of Shannara is a Tolkien clone, fairly close one-for-one mapping of many, many elements in it, and sold vast numbers. So why not continue to, because there was a fantasy audience out there aching for more Lord of the Rings, why not give it to them? And then even I noticed, I never look at the maps on books, but the map on this book looks curiously Lord of the Rings like. Old JRR could have got out his quill and drawn that map for Mr. Goodkind, but that's not unique to him. There's a whole, you could find now thousands, I suspect, of books that have a Tolkien-esque type map in them with those little trees and the shaded hills. But the thing that a lot of the 80s authors tried to copy from Tolkien was the description. They would put a lot of description in. Tolkien had a lot of description, but then I feel that the emphasis was more on quantity for the people who came after, rather than the quality that Tolkien had in his descriptions. And these lines, I've said that they're pretty wordy. I mean, I'm always cautioning against adding in extra superfluous adjectives. And this sort of cold, damp morning air. I mean, and then the whole, it's all pretty wordy. We've got these making it look as if and almost seeming to. That's just throwing more words on the page, which really aren't needed. You can cut those out, and you'll get much tighter, more interesting prose. Then we go on to the smell, where you get some points for using another sense. It's nice to have different senses coming into the thing, but okay, the vine doesn't smell too nice. It's not hooking me. There's nothing here that is grabbing me by the throat and saying, you must read this. And I actually did literally walk away from this book. I've heard the doorbell go, so I'm going to be editing this. And I'm back, hopefully with a seamless transition. Where were we? So next line I've made a point about is Richard combed his fingers through his thick hair. When you're writing a POV, a good deep POV that really sucks the reader in. This isn't like a cast iron rule, but it's a good idea if you're writing a POV to, by definition, view everything, the world, through the eyes of that character. And people don't tend to think of themselves in terms of their physical attributes being unusual. I mean, if they're like 8 feet tall, then yes, okay, maybe you would go around the world thinking, "Gosh, I'm tall. All these people look a bit small." But even then, it wouldn't be as pronounced as if you just took a regular person and turned them 8 feet tall. They would be used to it, and so they won't be thinking about how long their fingers are or how muscly their arms are, because that's just them. And so this Richard, he won't be thinking about how thick his hair is when he's running his fingers through it. Um, and that's just a minor point, but there it is. If you're writing a POV, don't use that POV to describe themselves, because that you weaken it, because that POV will not be thinking about themselves in those terms, generally speaking. Though some very self-conscious people might be, thinking about, well, no, my hair's thinning or something of this nature. So now we've got the fact he's coming out of the fog of his despair to focus on this vine. And that's, to be fair, another point of possible interest. Now we're wondering why he is despairing. He's scanning for others. I mean, maybe I'm being too nitpicky here, but it does feel a bit anachronistic. This is more like a Terminator 1000 when you're scanning. He looked around, and everything else looked normal. So we're on page 1. It's a bit of a nothing line, isn't it? Tell us what didn't look normal rather than. And now we go on and we just actually describe trees. Not even a weird vine, a weird but really quite boring vine, but we're describing trees. On page 1, we're talking about the autumn's tinge and the leaves rippling in the breeze, and the oaks hanging onto their leaves. No, I mean, okay, New York Times #1 bestseller. I know nothing, but no, I mean, you're on page 1. We know about trees. What are you doing, Terry? And in some of the other books I've looked at, where page 1s were books I'm really fond of, something similar has happened now and again, but it's been a case of, this is Josiah Bancroft or Lanny Taylor showing off, and you're allowed to show off their prose, to say, look, this is a gorgeous line. You keep on reading this book and you're going to get more gorgeous lines like this. And that's perfectly acceptable. But these aren't gorgeous lines. This is okay prose. But it's nothing to write home about. I'm not going to be diving into this book just so I can have more of him telling me that the leaves were tinged with crimson. Any even vaguely competent writer could have written this stuff about trees in autumn. Now, what are we on? Okay, so having spent most of his life in the woods, Richard knew all about plants, if not by name, by. It's basically exposition, isn't it? It's sort of, now someone remote is telling us some stuff about the situation, and it's not in POV, and it's not interesting. Okay, he knows a lot about plants, but I guess in context of having spotted this odd vine, fair enough. But none of it's hooking me. There's no compelling reason to keep on reading. And now we're diving back into past experiences with his old friend Zed, who isn't there. We're just being told about the interaction between him and this guy who isn't there on page 1, and their interaction isn't particularly interesting either. It's not. There's no something unique and interesting about this world. It's just generic. And now we're back to the vine. And we're having more of his memories about his father. So we moved from Zed, who we've not met, to his father, who's not met. I do make a point there that he says blue clay jar here, and he does throw in a lot of adjectives, but I thought this one was like an example of the sort of pinpoint description, pinpoint detail that I encourage sometimes. He didn't need to tell us that, but the fact that he added it in, it makes it more specific, and it actually makes the memory sound a bit more believable. It's less generic. I can hear Kellen howling in the background, so hopefully that's not reaching your delicate ears. They're going to take her out again. Um, so what are we doing? And so we've got these two memories, and now more description about what his father did, hunting antiquities, and then we're at the end of the page, and that's he's used up all of page one. And for me, when I read it maybe 15 years ago, I thought, well, there's no reason for me to turn over the page. If I'm going to get more of this, I don't want more of this, and I moved on to another book. I felt it was distant and wordy to the last. It was basically a couple of unexciting memories, a vine. Where's the problem? Where's the tension? Where's the something unique? Where's the hook? None of that. And I said that if this book was submitted to a publisher today, I don't think any of them would take it on. And if it was published, I don't think it would sell. But just my opinion. I have been wrong before many times. I will leave it with you. It didn't do any of the things I advise a new writer who's attempting to write a page one that will capture the reader's interest to do. And it gave us what I thought was a dull character, a generic situation, none of which was captured my interest. But I will return to the start. He sold millions. He made millions. What you going to do? Take your own lessons from that, and I will catch you the next time as I now begin my hunt for that button that allows me to escape.